What would you do if you were 42 years old and had never known the touch of another person? Not a handshake, not a hug, and certainly not a kiss. In the vast, unforgiving emptiness of 1880s Montana, a man named Samuel Crawford was living that exact life. He thought he would die on his 200 acres of harsh, lonely land without ever speaking to another soul in his own home. But on one stormy night, a single, desperate knock on his door was about to change everything. And what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about being alone. The autumn wind of 1884 screamed across Samuel Crawford's ranch. It was a mean wind, carrying the smell of dead grass and the promise of a brutal winter. At 42, his hands were cracked and calloused, moving with a rhythm that only comes from decades of doing the same thing, day in and day out, completely alone. He was securing the barn doors, his movements like a clockwork machine that had been wound up too many times. He was a tall, lean man, and his patched flannel shirt hung on him like a flag on a pole in a dead calm. The house behind him was just as solitary. 2 rooms, a stone chimney puffing out a ghost of smoke, and windows that had never been dressed with curtains. Windows that looked out onto nothing but more loneliness. He murmured something to his old mare, Belle, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. The horse, his only real companion, nuzzled his shoulder. It was the closest thing to affection he'd felt in a decade. As lightning spiderwebbed across the bruised purple sky, Samuel felt the weight of his secret. It was a secret heavier than a winter snowdrift. Down at the general store in Copper Ridge, 15 miles away, men his age talked about their wives, their children. Samuel just stood there, silent. How could he ever tell them the truth? That at 42 years old, a man who could birth a calf in a blizzard and mend any fence had never once held a woman's hand. His parents had been taken by a fever when he was just 18, leaving him the land and a silence that had grown bigger every year. The years just slipped away. He told himself there would be time for a wife later, but later never came. And now, the shame of his inexperience was a brand on his soul, hotter than the Montana sun. The storm broke with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain hammered his tin roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Samuel sat by the fire, mending a leather bridle, the picture of a man at peace, but inside, he was a ghost in his own life. That's when he heard it. 3 sharp knocks. His hands froze. The needle and leather fell from his grasp. In 5 years, maybe more, no one had come to his door after dark. He peered through the rain-slicked window and saw a shape, hunched against the wind. A woman. Her dark cloak was being whipped around like a mad thing. Samuel's heart, a slow and steady drum his entire life, suddenly began to pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. What in God's name was a woman doing out here? In this storm? A voice, faint but clear, came through the thick wood of the door. "Please, I need shelter! My wagon!" The wheel broke. Her voice was refined, desperate. Samuel's hand trembled as he reached for the latch. He was 42 years old, and he had never, not once, been alone with a woman inside his own home. The thought was the most terrifying and the most thrilling thing he had ever known. He pulled the heavy door open, and the wind howled, trying to force its way inside. The woman who stood on his threshold was like no one he had ever seen in the dusty streets of Copper Ridge. She was soaked through, her auburn hair plastered to her skull, but even the storm couldn't hide the elegance about her. Her green eyes, wide with fear and relief, held a dignity that was completely out of place in his rough-hewn world. "Ma'am," Samuel stammered, his voice cracking. "Come in. Get out of the cold." She stumbled inside, a puddle forming at her feet on the wooden floor. She looked to be in her late 30s, and her traveling dress, though torn and muddy, was made of a fine material he didn't recognize. "I'm Eleanor Morrison," she said, her hands shaking as she pulled off her heavy, wet cloak. "I was on my way to my sister's place near Fort Benton. I am so terribly sorry to impose on you." "No imposition," Samuel managed to say, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. Hearing her educated Eastern voice in his silent house was like a dream. "I'm Samuel Crawford. Let me get you something dry." He hurried into his bedroom, his mind a complete blank, and returned with his cleanest shirt and a pair of thick wool socks. He handed them to her without meeting her eyes. You can change behind that screen, he mumbled, pointing to a privacy screen he used for his own baths. As she disappeared behind it, Samuel busied himself with the fire, his hands clumsy. He knew with a sinking feeling that she would have to stay the night. The storm was only getting worse. His pulse hammered at the thought. A woman, sleeping in his house. Mr. Crawford? Her voice came from behind the screen, soft and hesitant. Do you live here all alone? The question was simple, but it felt like a judgment. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the words came out sharper than he intended. Always have. When she stepped out from behind the screen, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing his shirt. It was huge on her, falling almost to her knees. She looked so small, so vulnerable. And yet when she offered him a small, grateful smile, a warmth spread through his chest that he had never felt before. You are a very kind man, she said, taking the chair he offered by the fire. I was so frightened out there. This country is so empty. Gets lonely, Samuel admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. But you get used to it. She studied his face in the flickering firelight, her gaze thoughtful. How long have you been here? She asked. 24 years, since my folks passed. He poured them both coffee in tin cups, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. Built this place myself. She nodded, impressed. That is quite something, but it must be hard, all alone. She told him about her husband Charles, who had died of consumption 6 months prior. She was a widow, starting over. Sometimes, she said, her voice thick with a sadness he understood all too well. Starting over is the only choice you have. And as she spoke of her own loneliness, of her fear of never feeling alive again, Samuel saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own soul. Two lost people, huddled together by a fire, while the world raged outside. The storm was a monster, but for the first time in his life, Samuel didn't feel like he was facing it alone. He went to bed that night on the hard floor by the fireplace, giving her his bed. And as he listened to the sound of her soft breathing from the other room, a strange thought came to him. He was a man who had everything he needed to survive, but he was about to find out he had nothing he needed to live. As he drifted off, he saw her through the crack in the door, clutching a small leather pouch to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The morning broke gray and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. Samuel found Eleanor standing by the window, already dressed in her now dry skirt and his shirt, looking out at the sunrise. It's beautiful, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'd forgotten. In the clear morning light, he could see the deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but there was something else, too, a flicker of life that hadn't been there the night before. They made breakfast together, moving around his small kitchen in a comfortable silence that felt more natural than anything he'd ever known. He found himself watching her, the graceful way her hands moved, the way she tucked a stray piece of auburn hair behind her ear. When their fingers brushed as they both reached for a tin plate, a shock went through him, sharp and unfamiliar. It was the first time he had touched a woman in over 20 years. As they sat at his small table drinking coffee, she looked at him with those serious green eyes. Samuel, she began, and his heart gave a lurch. May I ask you something? He nodded, unable to speak. Last night, she said, choosing her words carefully, when I spoke of being alone, you seemed to understand. Have you truly been alone all this time? The question hung in the air between them. This was it, the moment his secret would be laid bare. He stared down at his coffee cup, the shame a hot coal in his throat. He tried to lie, to say it was by choice, but the words wouldn't come. He just shook his head, a small, defeated movement. I never learned how, he whispered, the admission costing him everything. He couldn't look at her. He waited for the pity, the disgust. Instead, he felt a warmth cover his hand. Eleanor had reached across the table, her touch gentle. You've never been with a woman, she stated, not as a question, but as a simple fact. He flinched, but nodded. 42 years old, he choked out. You must think I'm a pathetic fool. I think, she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through his shame, that you are one of the kindest men I have ever met, and I think that some people just have to wait longer for the right person to find them. He finally dared to look up. There was no pity in her eyes. There was compassion, yes, but something else too. Something that made his pulse quicken. My husband, Charles, she continued softly, he was a good man. Our marriage was comfortable. But I always wondered what it would feel like to be with someone who could make me feel passion. The word was a spark in the quiet room. Her hand was still on his, her thumb tracing slow circles on his skin, and Samuel felt like he couldn't breathe. I should go check on your wagon, he said abruptly, needing to escape the intensity of the moment. He stood up and practically fled the house. As he trudged through the mud toward the path where she'd left the wagon, her words echoed in his head. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever looked at him like that. He felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But in the unforgiving Montana wilderness, hope was a dangerous thing. It was a flicker that could be snuffed out in an instant. And as he reached the broken-down wagon, he saw something that made the cold morning air freeze in his lungs. The wheel wasn't just broken. The thick oak axle hadn't snapped from the rough terrain. There were marks on it, deep, straight, deliberate marks. It had been sawed almost all the way through. The breakdown wasn't an accident. It was a trap. Samuel stared at the saw marks on the axle, his mind reeling. The clean, sharp edges told a clear story. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had wanted this wagon to break down right here in the middle of nowhere, close to his ranch. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The woman in his house, the elegant, grieving widow, had lied to him. Her arrival wasn't fate. It was a plan. He walked back to the house slowly, his thoughts a tangled mess. The warmth he'd felt just minutes before had been replaced by a cold knot of suspicion. Who was she? What did she want? He was a poor rancher. He had nothing of value but the land itself. And it was hard land, barely enough to sustain one man. He decided to say nothing. He would watch her, listen, and wait. He was a patient man. The wilderness had taught him that. He told her the wheel would take at least a day to fix properly, that he'd need to fashion a new spoke from seasoned oak in his barn. She accepted the news with a quiet nod, her expression unreadable. I can help, she offered. I'm not afraid of work. All day she stayed with him in the barn. She held tools, she cleaned his cluttered workshop, she even helped him heat and shape the iron brace. They worked side by side, and the comfortable rhythm returned, but for Samuel, it was now layered with a tense undercurrent. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave him, he questioned. He watched for a slip, a clue to her real purpose. She talked more about her life in the East, about her late husband Charles. She described him as a quiet, scholarly man, a banker who loved books more than people. But her stories were vague, lacking the small, intimate details that make a memory real. It was like she was reciting a story she had memorized. That evening, as they ate the stew she had prepared, she seemed to sense his distance. You're quiet tonight, Samuel, she said, her green eyes searching his face. Is something wrong? He almost told her then. He almost confronted her with the truth of the sawed axle. But he looked at her face, so full of a believable, fragile hope, and he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if there was another explanation? His loneliness was a powerful voice, whispering in his ear, begging him not to shatter this fragile connection, even if it was built on a lie. Later that night, unable to sleep, he saw a light flicker in the barn. He crept out of the house, his old rifle in his hands, his heart pounding. He peered through a crack in the barn wall. Eleanor was there. She had her travel bag open, and by the light of a lantern she was studying a piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a map. A crude, hand-drawn map. He couldn't see the details, but he saw her trace a line with her finger, her lips moving silently. Then, she pulled something else from her bag. A pistol. Small and silver, it looked deadly in the flickering light. She checked it, made sure it was loaded, and then tucked it into the waistband of her skirt, hiding it under his oversized shirt. Samuel backed away from the barn, his mind numb. A map. A gun. This was no grieving widow. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. He had let a stranger into his home, into his life. And he had a terrible feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his 42 years. He had survived blizzards, droughts, and the crushing weight of solitude. But he wasn't sure he was going to survive Eleanor Morrison. The next morning, Samuel walked into the kitchen with a resolve as hard as forged steel. He couldn't live with the not knowing. He placed the tin coffee pot on the table with a thud that made Eleanor jump. "The axle on your wagon," he said, his voice flat and cold. "It didn't break. It was cut." Eleanor froze, the color draining from her face. Her teacup clattered against its saucer. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a fear that finally seemed genuine. He saw her glance instinctively toward the barn, where he knew she had stashed her things, including the gun. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I saw you last night," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "In the barn, with the map, and the pistol." The silence in the room was absolute. The gentle domestic scene of just moments before had shattered, replaced by a tense, dangerous standoff. He was a man who had never raised his voice to another soul. But now he felt a cold anger he didn't know he possessed. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want here?" She stared at him, her mask of the grieving widow completely gone. In its place was a woman who was cornered, desperate. And then, to his utter shock, she collapsed into her chair and began to weep. Not the silent, controlled sobs he'd witnessed before, but raw, gut-wrenching sobs of pure despair. "My name is not Eleanor," she cried, her words muffled by her hands. "It's Clara, Clara May Thompson." She told him everything. The story poured out of her in a torrent of fear and grief. Her husband wasn't a dead banker named Charles. She wasn't even married. Charles was her younger brother. And they weren't from the East. They were from a small homestead just 50 miles north. A year ago, a powerful and ruthless cattle baron named Silas Blackwood had taken an interest in their land. Not for grazing, but because of a rumor as old as the hills that there was gold hidden somewhere on the property. Her father, a stubborn and proud man, had refused to sell. So Blackwood and his men had come one night. They'd murdered her father in cold blood and burned their cabin to the ground, making it look like an accident. Clara and Charles had barely escaped with their lives. They had been on the run ever since, with Blackwood's men hunting them relentlessly. Blackwood wanted them silenced for good. "He's a monster," she whispered, her face pale. "He owns the law in 3 counties. There's nowhere to run." She had heard whispers about the reclusive rancher, Samuel Crawford, a man who kept to himself, who had no family, no connections, a ghost on the prairie. She saw his ranch not as a home but as a hiding place. She and Charles had planned it. She would stage a breakdown, gain his trust, and persuade him to let them hide out on his land for the winter, hoping Blackwood's search would cool. The map was of his property, to find the best places to lay low. The gun was for protection. "I was going to tell you," she pleaded, looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears. I didn't know how. You were so kind, kinder than anyone has ever been to me. I started to feel safe." Samuel stood there, his anger draining away, replaced by a profound, shocking revelation. He had opened his door to a lie, but it was a lie born of desperation, not malice. This woman wasn't here to harm him. She was running for her life, and by letting her in, he had unknowingly stepped into the middle of a war. His small, quiet world had just collided with a violent, bloody feud, and Silas Blackwood, a name he'd heard whispered with fear in Copper Ridge, was now looking for the woman sleeping in his bed. His isolated ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Samuel sank into the chair opposite her, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. His entire life, he had avoided trouble. He had built his world around silence and solitude, a fortress against the pains and complications of other people. And now, trouble had knocked on his door and he had let it in. Clara watched him, her breathing shallow, waiting for his verdict. Would he throw her out, send her to her death, or would he help her? For Samuel, there was no real choice. He had seen the truth in her eyes. And more than that, in the past 2 days, this woman had woken up a part of him he thought was long dead. To send her away now would be to sentence himself back to that living death. "Where's your brother?" he asked, his voice rough. "Hiding," she said, "in a cave system in the hills about 10 miles from here. We were supposed to meet in a week." Samuel nodded slowly, his mind racing. He was a rancher, not a gunman, but he knew his land better than any man alive. He knew every ravine, every creek bed, every rock formation. If a fight was coming, it would be on his terms. "You can stay," he said, and the relief that washed over Clara's face was so profound it almost brought him to his knees. "We'll figure this out, together." For the first time, their alliance was real, forged not in lies but in a shared, desperate reality. That day, he didn't fix her wagon. Instead, he took her out and they scouted his land. He showed her the hidden pathways, the natural choke points, the places a man could make a stand. She was a quick learner, her fear sharpening her senses. As they worked, he found himself looking at her differently. She wasn't the fragile city woman he'd first met. She was resilient, tough, a survivor. He saw the strength that lay beneath her fear, and he realized that his feelings for Eleanor were nothing compared to the growing admiration he had for Clara. That night, a real storm gathered inside the small house. The unspoken attraction that had been simmering between them, now charged by the danger they faced, became a palpable force. They sat by the fire, not as a lonely rancher and a stranger, but as two people bound by a secret that could get them both killed. "Why did you never—" she began, then hesitated. "Find a wife?" He finished for her. He told her everything, about his parents, his shyness, the years that just bled into one another, until he became a prisoner of his own solitude. It was the most he had ever spoken to anyone about himself. When he was finished, she reached out and took his calloused hand in hers. "Loneliness is a prison," she whispered. "I know." In that moment, the last wall around Samuel's heart crumbled. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. His first kiss wasn't gentle or shy. It was desperate, hungry, a lifetime of solitude pouring out in a single, explosive moment. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving his entire life and had just been offered a feast. But as they pulled apart, breathless, a sound from outside shattered the moment. The baying of a hound, distant but drawing closer, a hunting dog. Samuel grabbed his rifle and went to the window, his heart turning to ice. In the pale moonlight, he could see them. 3 riders on the ridge, dark silhouettes against the stars. They weren't just passing by. They were moving slowly, methodically, searching. Blackwood's men were here. The hunt was on. "Get away from the window!" Samuel hissed, pulling Clara down to the floor. The dog's barking grew louder, more frantic. They had caught her scent. Panic flared in Clara's eyes. "They found me!" she breathed. "Oh God, they found me!" Samuel's mind was a whirlwind. 3 of them, maybe more. He was one man with 1 rifle and a pistol. The odds were impossible. He had offered this woman sanctuary, and instead he had led her into a death trap. His fortress of solitude was about to become his tomb. "The cellar!" he said, his voice urgent. He dragged a thick bearskin rug from the floor, revealing a heavy wooden trapdoor. "It's small, but it leads to a narrow tunnel. Comes out in the creek bed behind the barn. You have to go, now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce, grabbing his arm. "They'll kill you." "They'll kill us both if you stay," he shot back. "Go. Get to your brother. Tell him what's happened." He could hear the riders now, their horses crashing through the brush, their voices carrying on the cold night air. There was no more time. He pushed the small pistol into her hand. "Don't use it unless you have to," he commanded. "Just run!" He lifted the heavy door. A wave of musty, cold air washed over them. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a terror that tore at his soul. She leaned in and kissed him again, a quick, desperate press of her lips against his. "Survive, Samuel Crawford," she whispered. And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness below. Samuel slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the rug back over it just as a heavy fist hammered on his front door. "Open up in there!" a rough voice bellowed. "We know she's with you, old man." He took a deep breath, grabbed his rifle, and walked to the door. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was a man with something to protect. He opened the door and found himself facing three hard-looking men, their faces illuminated by the lanterns they carried. The man in the front, a bear of a man with a scarred face, grinned cruelly. "We're looking for a woman," he said, his eyes scanning the inside of the cabin. "Seen anyone passing through?" Samuel looked him dead in the eye. "Haven't seen a soul in months," he said, his voice steady. The man's grin faded. He nodded to his partners. They pushed past Samuel, knocking him aside, and began to tear his small house apart. They were professionals. They overturned his mattress, threw his few books on the floor, smashed his crockery. They were looking for any sign of her. Samuel stood there, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle, praying that Clara had made it to the tunnel in time. He knew that the moment they found the trap door, he was a dead man. The scarred man walked over to the fireplace, where two tin coffee cups still sat on the hearth from that morning. He picked one up, a smirk spreading across his ugly face. He looked at Samuel. "You expecting company, old man?" he sneered. Before Samuel could answer, one of the other men kicked at the bearskin rug. It slid across the floor, revealing the clear outline of the trapdoor beneath. Silence. The scarred man's eyes locked onto the door, then slowly lifted to meet Samuel's. The game was up. "Well, well," the man said, drawing a long, wicked-looking revolver from his belt. "Looks like you're a liar." Samuel didn't hesitate. He brought the butt of his rifle up in a powerful arc, smashing it into the jaw of the man closest to him. The man crumpled to the floor with a sickening crack. At the same time, Samuel dove behind his heavy oak table, just as the scarred man's pistol roared, the bullet splintering the wood where his head had just been. The third man raised his own gun, but Samuel was faster. He fired his rifle from the hip. The blast was deafening in the small cabin. The third man screamed and staggered back, clutching a bloody shoulder before collapsing. Now it was just him and the leader, the scarred man. Samuel chambered another round as the man fired again, the bullet ricocheting off the stone fireplace. The air was thick with gunpowder and the smell of blood. Samuel knew he had only seconds. He kicked the leg of the table, sending it crashing over, and in that split second of distraction, he fired again. The bullet caught the scarred man in the chest. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, a look of pure surprise on his face. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell like a felled tree. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of Samuel's own breathing. 3 bodies lay on his floor. His quiet home had become a slaughterhouse. He scrambled over to the trap door and wrenched it open. "Clara!" he yelled into the darkness. There was no answer. He grabbed a lantern and lowered himself into the cellar. The tunnel was narrow and damp. He crawled through it, his heart pounding with a new fear. What if they had men covering the creek bed? He emerged into the cold night air, his eyes scanning the darkness. The creek was empty. She was gone. Had she made it, or had they caught her? He looked at the blood on his hands, at the carnage back in his house, and a terrible realization dawned on him. He hadn't ended the threat. He had just declared war. Silas Blackwood would not take the deaths of 3 of his men lightly. He would send more. He would send an army if he had to. Running was no longer an option. The only way to survive this was to fight. And the only way to fight was to find Clara and her brother and face Blackwood together. He was just a rancher, but they had brought the war to his front door, and he would be damned if he didn't finish it. Samuel didn't waste time. He dragged the bodies of Blackwood's men into the barn, covering them with a canvas tarp. He knew he was only buying a few hours, a day at most, before they were missed. He packed a small bag with dried jerky, a canteen of water, and all the ammunition he owned. He had to assume Clara was heading for the caves where her brother Charles was hiding. That was his only lead. He saddled his mare, Belle, the horse sensing his urgency and fear. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, he rode out, leaving his home, the only world he had ever known, behind him. The tracks were faint, but he found them. A woman's boot print in the soft mud by the creek bed, heading north into the rocky, treacherous foothills. He pushed Belle hard, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, expecting to see riders at any moment. The 10 miles to the cave system felt like 100. The terrain grew harsher, the land rising into jagged canyons and steep, pine-choked ridges. It was land that could swallow a person whole. He found the entrance to the caves late in the afternoon. hidden behind a waterfall that tumbled down a sheer rock face. It was a perfect hiding spot. He dismounted, his rifle ready, and called her name. Clara! His voice echoed in the enclosed space. A moment later, she appeared from behind the curtain of water, her face pale but her eyes fierce. The relief of seeing her safe was so overwhelming, he almost collapsed. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her was a young man, thin and wiry, with the same green eyes but a shifty, nervous energy that Samuel disliked instantly. This had to be her brother, Charles. Samuel! Clara cried, running to him. You're alive! He held her for a moment, the feel of her in his arms a reassurance that this nightmare was real. Then he looked past her at Charles. They found us, Samuel said grimly. 3 of them. They're dead. Charles's eyes went wide. You killed them? He stammered. You killed Blackwood's men? I had no choice, Samuel said flatly. He explained what had happened, how the men had found the trap door. As he spoke, he watched Charles. The young man wasn't relieved. He was terrified. He paced back and forth in the small space behind the waterfall. We're dead, Charles muttered, running a hand through his greasy hair. He'll send everyone. We have to run, Clara. We have to go now. Head for the territories. Run where, Charles? Clara shot back, her voice filled with frustration. We've been running for a year. There's nowhere left to go. Samuel is right. We have to make a stand. Make a stand? Charles laughed, a high, hysterical sound. With what? An old rancher and a rusty rifle against Silas Blackwood? You're insane! An argument erupted between the siblings, their voices rising in the enclosed space. It was clear this was an old fight between them. Clara, the fighter, and Charles, the runner. As they argued, Samuel's eyes wandered around the cave. It was small but dry. A campfire smoldered in the center and 2 bedrolls were laid out. But something was wrong. There were 3 bedrolls, and a saddlebag he didn't recognize, made of fine tooled leather. A rich man's saddlebag. He walked over to it. Who else is with you? Samuel asked, his voice cutting through their argument. Clara and Charles stopped, turning to look at him. No one, Charles said a little too quickly. That's my bag. Samuel knew he was lying. He reached down and unbuckled the strap. Inside, among some clothes, was a silver flask, engraved with the initials S.B. Silas Blackwood. Samuel's blood ran cold. He pulled the flask out and held it up. Is this yours too? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Clara stared at the flask, her face a mask of confusion and horror. She looked at her brother, who refused to meet her gaze. Charles, she whispered, what is this? What have you done? And then a new voice came from the shadows at the back of the cave, a deep, chilling voice that oozed menace. It seems my hospitality has been discovered. A large figure stepped out into the firelight. He was a mountain of a man, dressed in expensive clothes with cold, dead eyes and the cruel grin Samuel had seen on his henchmen. It was Silas Blackwood, and standing right beside him, holding a rifle leveled at Clara's heart, was the scarred man from the cabin, the man Samuel had shot in the chest. But there was no bullet hole, and no blood, just a thick leather vest under his torn shirt. The whole thing from the very beginning had been a lie. It was all a trap, and he had walked right into it. Charles, you fool, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at the terrified young man. I told you to get rid of that. The truth crashed down on Samuel with the force of a physical blow. The attack on the cabin. It was staged. The fight. The gunshots. All of it was a performance designed to make Samuel run, to lead them right here. To Clara. Charles had sold them out. He had been working for Blackwood all along. Why? Clara choked out, her eyes locked on her brother, her face a canvas of betrayal. He killed Papa. Papa was a fool, Charles shrieked, his fear turning to rage. A fool who died for a patch of dirt and a stupid rumor. Mr. Blackwood offered me a deal, a way out, money, a new life. All I had to do was deliver you, and the deed you've been carrying. The deed. Clara instinctively clutched at the small leather pouch she always wore around her neck, Blackwood's cold eyes fixed on it. Give it to me, girl, he ordered. It's over. The scarred man, whose name was Jeb, jabbed his rifle toward Clara. Don't be stupid. Samuel stood frozen, his mind trying to process the layers of deception. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. His loneliness,
his desperation. They had used it all against him. They had played him perfectly. "And you," Blackwood said, turning his dead eyes on Samuel. "The lonely rancher. The ghost. You were the perfect bait. We knew she'd run to the nearest hiding place." He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Turns out even ghosts can be useful." Blackwood stepped forward, reaching for the pouch around Clara's neck. In that moment, something inside Samuel snapped. He was not a ghost. He was not a pawn. And he would not stand by and watch the only person who had ever made him feel alive be destroyed. With a roar of pure rage, he lunged. Not at Blackwood, but at the campfire. He kicked the burning logs with all his strength, sending a shower of hot coals and embers flying through the small cave, the air filled with smoke and blinding sparks. Clara screamed. Charles yelled in panic. Jeb, the scarred man, fired his rifle, but the shot went wild in the chaos, ricocheting off the cave walls. Samuel grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the one place he knew they might have a chance.
The waterfall. "Run!" he bellowed, dragging her with him. They plunged through the curtain of water, the icy shock of it taking their breath away, and scrambled out into the fading daylight. They could hear Blackwood shouting orders from inside the cave. They had maybe 30 seconds. Samuel looked around frantically. They were trapped in a box canyon. The only way out was the way he came in. But Belle, his horse, was still there. "Get on the horse!" he yelled, shoving Clara toward the animal. "I'll hold them off!" "No!" she cried, clinging to him. "Not without you!" There was no time to argue. He could see Blackwood and Jeb emerging from the waterfall, their guns raised. Samuel did the only thing he could. He slapped Belle hard on the rump. The startled horse reared and then bolted, galloping down the narrow canyon path with Clara clinging desperately to its back. Blackwood raised his pistol to fire at the fleeing horse, but Samuel charged him, a wild man fueled by adrenaline and despair. He slammed into Blackwood, and the two of them went down in a tangle of limbs. Jeb swung his rifle butt at Samuel's head. Pain exploded behind his eyes, and the world dissolved into a dizzying spiral of blackness. His last conscious thought was of Clara, riding away, her hair flying behind her. He had saved her, but he knew, as the darkness took him, that he had just signed his own death warrant. Samuel awoke to the rhythmic rocking of a horse and a throbbing pain in his head that felt like a blacksmith's hammer. He was slumped over a saddle, his hands tied in front of him. He slowly pushed himself up, his vision swimming. They were riding through a dense forest, Blackwood in the lead, Jeb riding beside him. They had taken his horse, Belle. "Glad to see you're awake," Blackwood said without turning around. "Wouldn't want you to miss the homecoming." Samuel's mind was groggy, but one thought cut through the fog. Clara. Had she escaped? He had to believe she had. He had to believe his sacrifice meant something. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the mountains. Finally, they came to a clearing, and in the center of it stood a massive, newly built lodge, more of a fortress than a home. This was the heart of Blackwood's empire. They dragged him from the horse and threw him into a small, dark room in the back of the lodge. It was a meat locker, cold and smelling of iron. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, and a bolt was thrown. He was a prisoner, days blurred into a nightmare of cold, darkness, and pain. Once a day, Jeb would bring him a piece of stale bread and a cup of water, usually accompanied by a kick or a punch. They were keeping him alive for a reason, and he found out why a few days later. The bolt slid back, and the door creaked open. Silas Blackwood stood there, a lantern in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. "Your girlfriend is proving to be a problem," Blackwood snarled. "She linked up with some old friends of her father's. Small-time ranchers, but they're getting bold. Raiding my supply lines, causing trouble. She's become a symbol." He stepped into the cell, his shadow looming over Samuel. "She has the deed. Without it, my claim to that valley is complicated. But she won't come out of hiding. She's smart. So, I'm going to give her a reason to." He smiled, and it was the scariest thing Samuel had ever seen. "I'm going to send her a piece of you, every day, until she brings me that deed." A cold dread, far worse than anything he had felt before, washed over Samuel. This was his fate, to be used, piece by piece, to torture the woman he had tried to save. Blackwood left, and a moment later, Jeb entered, a long, thin knife in his hand. "Nothing personal, old man," the scarred man grunted. "Boss's orders. Let's start with a finger, shall we?" But as Jeb lunged forward, the world outside the meat locker exploded. A shotgun blast blew the lodge's front door off its hinges. Men were shouting, guns were firing. The raid Blackwood had feared was happening right now. Jeb froze, his head whipping toward the sounds of battle. In that moment of hesitation, Samuel acted. He kicked out with all his might, catching Jeb square in the knee. The man howled as his leg buckled. The knife flew from his hand, skittering across the stone floor. Samuel dove for it, his bound hands scooping it up. Jeb recovered quickly, drawing his pistol, but Samuel was already moving, slashing upward with the blade. He severed the ropes around his wrists and, in the same fluid motion, plunged the knife deep into Jeb's side. The scarred man gasped, a look of shock on his face, before slumping to the floor. Samuel didn't wait. He grabbed Jeb's pistol and burst out of the meat locker. The main room of the lodge was chaos. A handful of ranchers, grizzled and tough, were locked in a fierce gunfight with Blackwood's men. And leading them, firing a rifle from behind a large stone fireplace, was Clara. Their eyes met across the smoky room. The look on her face, shock, relief, and a burning fury, was something he would never forget. The tide of the battle turned. With Samuel joining the fight, Blackwood's men were caught in a crossfire. One by one, they fell. Soon, only Blackwood himself was left, cornered behind a large overturned table, his face a mask of rage. "You!" he bellowed, firing at Samuel. "I should have killed you when I had the chance!" The ranchers laid down a covering fire, and Samuel and Clara advanced. Blackwood was out of options. He made a desperate run for the back door, but Samuel was faster. He tackled the big man, sending them both crashing to the floor. They wrestled for the gun, two men locked in a primal struggle for survival. Blackwood was stronger, his powerful hands closing around Samuel's throat, squeezing the life out of him. Samuel's vision started to go dark, and then a gunshot, deafeningly close. Blackwood's body went rigid. The pressure on Samuel's throat released. He gasped for air as Blackwood rolled off him. Standing over them, a smoking pistol in her hand, was Clara. There was a look of grim finality on her face. She had avenged her father. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared, Clara rushed to Samuel's side. The other ranchers, her father's friends, gathered around, their faces full of respect for the quiet man who had fought like a lion. But it wasn't over. As Clara helped Samuel to his feet, her brother Charles stumbled out from a back room where he'd been hiding, his hands raised in surrender. He looked from the dead bodies of Blackwood's men to his sister's cold, unforgiving face. "Clara, he began. She cut him off. "Get out," she said, her voice like ice. "Take a horse and ride. If I ever see you again, I will finish what Silas Blackwood started." Charles, his face crumbling with shame and fear, turned and fled without another word. The betrayal was too deep to ever be forgiven. They found the deed in Blackwood's safe, along with documents proving his rampant land grabbing and corruption. The fight was over. Justice, rough and born of gunpowder, had finally come to the valley. Weeks later, Samuel and Clara returned to his ranch. His small house, once a monument to his isolation, now felt different. It felt like a home. They stood on the porch, watching the sunset over the vast Montana prairie. The land was the same, but they were not. He was no longer the shy, lonely man who was afraid of the world, and she was no longer the frightened girl on the run. "What about the gold?" Samuel asked quietly. The rumor that had started it all. "It's just a story, Samuel," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The real treasure was the land itself. My father knew that." Samuel put his arm around her. He had lived 42 years in silence, believing his life was over before it had even begun. But a knock on the door in the middle of a storm had changed everything. It had brought lies, betrayal, and death to his doorstep. But it had also brought love. It had brought him Clara. He had found something more precious than gold. He had found a reason to live. The Montana wilderness is full of secrets, and sometimes the most dangerous storms aren't the ones in the sky, but the ones inside the human heart. They can break you, or they can wash you clean and show you what truly matters. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales where nothing is ever as it seems, Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next strange and mysterious story.